Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet, in alliance with Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals.
So why is it so that the state and the economy run sort of contradictory to each other?
Well, I think that goes to the nub of what do we want our state to do? So, unfortunately, when we talk about the Indian state, obviously we have all various visions of what it should be doing. But at least in my view, we've got ultimately to be very clear about what the Indian state will do. And I think it should be basically a limited but strong state. So let me contrast it with the Nehruvian idea of a sort of soft, all-pervasive, but weak state.
That's the Ashokan state.
That's the Ashokan state, which I write
I know,
quite
yes.
a lot of...
You write that Ashoka laid out everything on an edict.
Yeah.
Brush your teeth, I'm simplifying it, brush your teeth in the morning, wake up at this time, sleep at this time.
And you have a Dharma Mahamanta, the religious police who will make sure that you do such thing.
Absolutely.
Because just like a parent hands over her children to wet nurse, so Ashoka handed over his subjects to the Dharma Mahamanta.
So that's the Mai Baap Sarkar, classical Mai Baap Sarkar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the problem here is that we have imbibed this to such an extent that we want the state to do all these things. So I think in the end, we, the people of India, have got to accept that the state has a role to play. I'm not a libertarian by any means. I believe that the state is needed. But the state has to be limited to doing certain things. It should provide defense, it should provide municipal governance, it should perhaps enforce contracts, not the government, but the judiciary, justice, things like this, which clearly the market cannot deliver. For all other things, we have got to allow the rest of the system to do it, private sector, civil society, whatever it is. And the state has got to take the view that in its own purview, it delivers the goods. For the rest of society has to also pull along. But unfortunately, this Mai Baap Sarkar idea is now so well ensconced in our, I think, our bloodstream, that whenever something goes wrong, oh my God, the government must intervene and do something about it. It's not always obvious that it should. I would argue that the last 2 or 3 economic surveys, which I have been fortunate to co-author, have had a very significant impact on what happened subsequently in policy. Whether it's in terms of arguing unapologetically for privatization, or the farm laws or the labor laws that were done, but generally about deregulation. And I'll give an example that is a more micro example. Since the time of the East India Company, cartography and any geospatial mapping was a monopoly of the Survey of India. Now, why was it a monopoly of the Survey of India? Because during the period of British occupation, the British occupiers did not want any of the natives or any of their rivals to have good maps of this country. So naturally, they made it into a monopoly. Now, question is, why did we continue it after independence, especially when it was quite obvious that any military use of it was quite obsolete, because everybody, from the 70s, people had satellites which were taking photographs of all military installations.
Indian Air Force has been using US Air Force maps in the Himalayas.
Absolutely. So why is it that it required you to come to 2021 when everybody already was using Google Maps illegally, technically, for us to open this up? Because there was this idea in our back of our minds that somehow the default is that the government controls it unless it opens it up. Whereas in fact, we should have the opposite view, that unless there is an overriding reason, it should be open, and only if there is an overriding reason do you control it. So our default has always been the Mai Baap, that daddy will allow you, then you're allowed to stay out late. So this is the fundamental problem. One thing we talked about was taxpayers' rights. So ironically, we have always talked about, what are the rules in the Income Tax Act, for example, or about the taxpayer, thou shalt pay on time, thou shalt do this and thou shalt do that, all directed towards the taxpayer. What are the rights of the taxpayer vis-a-vis the tax collector? So if you notice, just about 6 months ago, we have explicitly laid out what are the rights of the taxpayer. Now, of course, the enforcement of that also requires an ombudsman system, which we are thinking about. But at least we have laid out explicitly what are the rights of the taxpayer vis-a-vis the tax collector. So I think the point being made here is that the limits of the state are also being laid out. So this is not, as I keep pointing out, this is not a case of a libertarian who wants a minimalist state or a hardcore Marxist who wants a withering away of the state.
So one area in which we get spanked, in fact, we get spanked in two areas. One is construction permits. The second is enforcement of contracts.
Yes, and both of them are good examples of what is wrong. One of them, a construction permit, is an area where the state, obviously there's no country in the world where construction permits are randomly distributed by the market. That's something the state will have to do. There's some control will have to be imposed. And the other is enforcement of contracts that the judicial system has to enforce. Both of them are state failures. See, there's a large amount of literature that is taught in economics classes in every university in India about market failure. And indeed, there is market failure. But the fact of the matter is, an equal problem is that of state failure.
State failure, yes.
And that is unfortunately assumed not to exist. So I have tried very hard, in fact, to talk about state failure. If you read my economic survey, this year's economic survey has a whole chapter, I think it's chapter 6 in volume 1, on regulations. And the problem is that our entire regulatory system is based on this idea that, look, we must have regulation for every possible outcome.
We make rules and laws for lawbreakers.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the same concept that, we create rules for lawbreakers. So what happens is the lawbreakers continue to not follow the law. It's the poor compliant person who has to comply with all these rules and is carrying around the weight. So this is precisely the problem. And the reason this happens is because in the back of our minds, in the end, we still have this for economists, this is called an Arrow-Debrau model of the world, where basically the idea is that it is possible to work out what all the possible outcomes are and to work out precisely what you should do in each of those circumstances. And this is a great law in India, a great regulation in India is one where you worked out all the possible outcomes and have a protocol for each one of them. Now, in the real world, there are an infinite number of possible paths that history can take. So consequently, it is always obvious that we will end up in a situation which was not prescribed. So our reaction then is to add another 5 rules to take care of those new situations. And very quickly it becomes so unwieldy and complicated that nobody can follow any of the rules. It is actually not possible to be a law-abiding citizen in this country.
Absolutely.
Because even at this point, I'm sure I am breaking some rule or the other by simply existing. So, therefore, you then create circumstances for rent seeking and other things that then come with a situation.
Yeah, because when you have systems like this, then you must have discretion also.
Absolutely.
On a wider plane, if you were to rebuild the Indian state, a new social contract between Indian state, India's economy and people, what would you do?
First of all, I think we should be very clear about what the state should be doing. State should be providing certain basic things. And here, I'm taking the judiciary and the wider state into account. And here, I would go back actually to the original Arthashastra of Kautilya. It's very interesting. People tend to remember Kautilya as some sort of a guy who was thinking only about
enemies and
spies and things like that. But in fact, the Arthashastra is actually quite a wide document. And while you may not want in modern times to use some of his exact prescriptions in terms of, how to deal with punishments and things like that.
But that was 300
years ago. There was 2,500, 300 years ago. But the general concept of statecraft in it is actually right. So what does he really want you to do? He wants the government to essentially provide external and internal security. The government or the state issues currency. It regulates bads, so social bads like in the case of Kautilya, he regulates prostitution, alcohol, and so on. I, for one, am a great believer that bad should be regulated, not banned.
Yeah.
In India, everything is either mandatory or it is banned.
But that's what Kautilya said. He said regulate. He didn't want it
Absolutely.
banned, yes.
He's absolutely clear on this. And then, of course, things like urban design
In fact,
and
if we
municipal
were a
issues.
Kautilyan state, we would allow betting in cricket.
Yes, we would.
A lot of the match fixing will go.
Absolutely. So he was very much about regulating rather than banning. Again, very different from the Indian state today. Today, the Indian state either makes everything mandatory or it bans it. To a large extent, this world that will emerge is essentially unknown. The jobs of the future for 10 years out will be completely new jobs. So I think the Indian state should not be in the business of trying to predict too much of this. The job of the Indian state is, one, to create the physical infrastructure that is definitely going to be needed. And here also we should keep an open mind about the changing needs of the economy. But other than that, we should basically get simple taxation, deregulate to the extent possible, and create spaces for the animal spirits of the private sector to generate these jobs. If I knew where those digital jobs are going to emerge, I shouldn't be wasting my time sitting here having this conversation with you. I should actually be Elon Musk investing in all these things. Since I do not know, I am an economist. If I didn't, I would be a billionaire. If I knew, I would be a billionaire investing in these areas. So the point is, it's not the business of the state other than occasionally to create clusters or for emerging, to provide protection to an emerging sector.
But it has to create an environment for entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. It needs to create an environment for entrepreneurship. As I said, that requires deregulation. It requires certain amount of physical infrastructure that has to be in place. It requires simplification of the tax system. And we have simplified the corporate tax structure in late 2019, if you remember. I think the direct taxes on individuals also needs to be significantally simplified from where we are.
We came close to it. There was a direct taxes code, but what happened? We got cold feet.
Well, it was discussed very thoroughly, and I believe my colleague, the chief economic advisor, was involved in looking through it. I don't know what its current status is, but there is a draft of it which has been discussed, yes.
Yeah. Do you see a $5 trillion economy achieved by then? Or do you think this will be a case of shifting timelines?
I think some shift of timeline may happen, but I think the drift will be much smaller than people fear. And so let me explain. First of all, the shock that came from the COVID, yes, obviously, the worldwide we got hit by it, we got hit by it in India as well. But I think you will see a very strong recovery. Now, in the economic survey, we talk about a 11% real GDP growth rate. With inflation and other things, we'll probably, in nominal terms, hit 15%.
15%, yes.
But I think that is a conservative number. I would be very, very surprised if it is not significantly higher than this.
We have Sanjay Agarwal of AU Bank. It's a small finance bank which is doing very well. One of the new ones. And he has a concern about MSMEs. And I don't understand this very much, but he's in the market. He says that now MSME status has been withdrawn from traders. So with that, traders no longer have access to bank loans that they would have had if they were MSMEs. And in rural India, generally in the unorganized sector, interest rates are usurious, 36%, 39%, 40%, because people are desperate to borrow. So is something being done to bring them in the picture?
So this is not, we don't have any ideological problem about this. This is a problem that has been brought to our notice.
Right.
And and I agree that you do want the trading sector to be alive and well. And in fact, I can say that without this sector and the small network of small kirana shops in the country, we would not have survived through the lockdowns over the last 1 year. So this, the small trader is an important part of our economic system, and we want to support it. Yes, so this has been brought to us, and there are people looking into this issue as we speak. So whatever sensible can be done to adjust for this will be done.
Do you see GST as a success or as a failure?
I would agree. I would say it's a huge success. And here again, let me say, introducing something like GST, or for that matter, the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code, these are framework issues. Whenever we introduced it, at some point in our economic history, we had to introduce them. And whenever we did it, it would have been disruptive. But now that some time has passed, I would say that this system is, most businesses will agree that this system works reasonably smoothly. It is a significant improvement on whatever used to exist, because it's not as if some system didn't exist before. The question is this system significantly better than whatever exists before? And I think most people will agree it does. Even small businesses who used to complain more about it. Big businesses always thought it was a good idea. And it certainly has created an Indian common market. Not so long ago, it was easier for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai than to trade with Delhi. That has now certainly changed. We do genuinely have a common market.
Some of that is getting messed up now with the states coming up with these new laws, 75% locals, 75% locals. That is in a different common market.
Well, the labor market, yes. So now one of the interesting things that will happen here, because you can no longer protect, in a sense, your goods market, trying to provide protectionism to your labor market will have some interesting consequences, because now there is huge incentives for other states to wean away your businesses because they can sell you the goods from anywhere else.
Exactly.
So competitive federalism will take care of this.
What will be your advice to Haryana government and Jharkhand government?
My advice would not be to them. My advice would be to their competitor states to kindly come to Gurgaon and wean away them. Let the competitive energies of different states do what they're supposed to do. I have no advice for people who want to introduce restrictions. It's
because I read this Haryana law, and it said that in areas where you can prove to us that the necessary expertise does not exist, we will permit you to have workers from outside. That's like an H-1B visa within India.
Yes, except you do not have any control on services and goods being supplied.
Right.
So all I'm trying to say is let the market function. Now it may be that Haryana then moves up the value chain into areas that are above their 50,000 rupee slab, and it becomes the Silicon Valley of India, and all the high-tech people want to live in Gurgaon, and all the low-tech stuff moves out. That's also perfectly fine. It is for them to judge. I'm not here to judge.
Except it will lose their purpose of creating low-paid jobs.
Maybe yes, maybe not. But that is, as I said, it is a democracy.
Problem,
It is a democracy. Let the feedback loop of democracy and economics then play itself out. My main objection usually is to the idea that is in fact to this idea that they will allow these exceptions, because that will mean that some bureaucrat is allowed to take a judgment on whether this should be allowed or that should be allowed. That is where my main objection is.
We also know
if it was a simple rule.
We also know who's the minister squatting over these portfolios, and he's
that, as I said, I can't comment on it.
This is a coalition issue.
Let me give you examples of unbelievable things which are not explored by Haryanvis themselves. So not very far from here, about an hour and a half drive south of here through Gurgaon, there's a hill called Dhosi Hill, in very close to the Haryana-Rajasthan border. Now, it's a part of the Aravalli Hills, and it is one of the oldest geological features on this planet. It is an ancient volcano. It's a pyramidical shape, and if you bother to climb to the top of it, there is a caldera with a small kund.
I see.
Now, it's a beautiful place, by the way, and beautiful views of the surrounding landscape, but it is a very interesting place for other reasons. This is the original place where the Bhrigu family of rishis used to live and had their hermitage. And there was a rishi called Chavanya, who was Bhrigu Rishi's son, who took a dip because he had leprosy, I believe, and he took a dip in this kund and he was cured. And after he got cured, he became the father of Ayurveda. So Chavanya Prash is from Chavanya Rishi.
From there. Okay.
So he had his hermitage in there. And the point of the matter, it's a beautiful location. And if you climb up...
You've been walking up and down the Aravali's quite a bit.
Absolutely.
I see from your Twitter
yes.
postings.
So it's a phenomenally beautiful landscape. And I'm amazed that almost nobody goes there. I spent a day walking up this with Arjun, in fact. And from there, you can see the Khetri mines, copper mines on one side. On the other side, you can see where the Drishadwati and the Saraswati used to meet. And further out, although it's a hazy, because it's too hazy, you can't see it. But I believe not far away, if you were looking due north, you would be able to see Rakhigadi. So this is really the heart of Indian civilization. And yet we don't bother with this at all. I mean, most Haryanvis don't know about it.
Most certainly don't. At least I did.
So I think I do need to explain what Atma Nirbhar Bharat is. So first of all, let me clearly state, this is not some attempt to return to pre-1991 import substitution. Neither I nor anybody in the government has any interest in going back to driving. And
you are sure the Prime Minister doesn't want it, and this Swadeshi Jagran Manch kind of pressure doesn't work?
I can clearly tell you that the Prime Minister has no interest in going back to driving in ambassador cars again. About a year ago, when this whole COVID thing started, we discovered something interesting about one of our most competitive sectors, which is our drugs and pharmaceutical sector. Everybody loves our drugs and pharmaceutical sector. Everybody agrees that it is extremely globally competitive. But we learned very quickly that it was entirely dependent on single source APIs from China.
Active pharmaceutical intermediaries, what is it?
API, good question. Active pharmaceutical inputs, I think.
Okay.
I'm not dead sure. I have now forgotten. But it's basically pharmaceutical inputs.
That's right.
And the idea basically is the following, that if I decide to provide a certain amount of protections that the key ones get produced in India, this is not an act of protectionism in the pre-1991 sense. This is merely being practical about managing the resilience of an extremely competitive global industry. This is how we think about this. Same thing is true, we'll provide protection for certain kinds of defense sectors. Now, but this is very different from, say, stopping foreign companies from coming and doing business here. We are allowing foreign companies to come here and invest in defense. We are opening up insurance. Just in this budget, we have done 74% now. So what we want, basically saying that, come and do business here. This is true of foreign business coming here, but we are also telling, as your question pointed out, we want Indian industry to go out there and do their stuff. So deregulate it, encourage domestic competition, but also domestic industry, provide in certain areas a certain amount of support. And that is where these PLI schemes, the production-linked incentive schemes.
Are you okay with the idea of corporates running, industrial groups running banks?
That is a more complicated question. There is one question, should private sector be allowed a bigger space? Unequivocally, yes.
Yes.
In the case of allowing the corporate sector to come in, then you have to manage an additional problem, which is of conflict of interest. Should then a bank which
lend to that group,
lend to the same group? Now, if it is a standalone institution which is doing its own thing, then I have no problem. If it is linked to another group and it is lending to the same group, then the question is, who decides on credit quality? Will they be able to, will the Chinese walls be good enough that some amount of favoritism doesn't happen? After all, the banking system in the end, in every country, is implicitly backed by taxpayers.
Yeah.
So consequently, we will end up implicitly backing an entire corporate group. So this is a much more complicated issue than saying private sector being allowed in. And here I have some misgivings of being completely allowing free, sort of laissez-faire in this. So there has to be some restrictions, and they have to be carefully designed. So this is not an area where I want free flow.
What are the bond prices telling us now?
So globally,
yields are going up in India.
So this has to be, so the Indian global popping up of yields has to be seen in the context of what is happening globally. And this is a little evolved. So
Because in your previous avatar, you worked for an international bank.
yes, and my job was to bet on interest rates and exchange rates.
Right.
So this is actually a very involved issue. So you'll have to give me a few minutes to explain this.
Sure.
You see, as a part of this reinflation of the world, the reserve currency issuing countries, particularly the US, has pumped out a huge amount of money supply. Now, it was needed from the narrow perspective of reinflating the economy from where we are right now. However, here comes the tricky bit. What happens when you increase the amount of money by such a large amount when it is not clear when you will be able to suck it out again? Because any attempt to suck it out too early will cause you to spiral down again. So now the question is, and this is really nobody knows the answer, will this trigger inflation or not?
In the US.
Well, in the world, because they are the reserve currency.
Yeah, because $1.9 trillion more has now come.
Well, that is on the fiscal side, which will obviously financed also through another monetary boost. So there's this huge amount of money sloshing around on the planet, and it finds its way into commodity prices like oil prices and every kind of other things through our foreign exchange reserves that even feeds through to our money supply. So since this is the amount of money that is sloshing around, the question is, will it trigger inflation or not? I think we have done correctly. For the time being, we have allowed the rupee to appreciate in a creeping sort of way and accumulated a large amounts of reserves. But this reserves that we are accumulating does not earn us anything, and it is denominated in the very reserve currencies that are being printed too much of. So at some point in time, we will have to begin to take a call on when we begin to think of the rupee itself as a reserve currency. Because that will mean that we will then have to be willing to allow the rupee to become an international currency.
If I may interrupt for a second, did you mean we've allowed rupee to appreciate or depreciate slowly?
Appreciate.
Appreciate.
So if you look at the rupee in the last 1 year, it's been
in terms of inflation, it has appreciated.
Yes. So why is it has appreciated a little bit, but in fact, if the Reserve Bank was not accumulating reserves like the blazes, now we have almost 600 billion worth of reserves, the rupee would probably, I'm just guessing, it would probably be at 60 something, 65 or some such level. So we have creepingly allowed it to appreciate, but stood in the way. Why have we accumulated all these reserves? Well, one part of it is that by accumulating these reserves, we are allowing this money to flow through into our economy, which was a good thing because we wanted excess liquidity in our own financial system during we were going through this shock. So this was one advantage to it. The second advantage to it is that we built up this huge bulwark of reserves, which means that we now have more reserves than we have debt. So India, interestingly, is currently a net creditor country to the rest of the world, including private sector debt. This means that whether we get a ratings downgrade or whatever other shocks may come our way, we are insulated from it because we are a creditor country in the end. And so this is a good thing. We have built this bulwark.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet, in alliance with Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals,